President Biden the other day gave a speech where he was saying that the rich should pay their fair share of taxes. And this is something that we hear not just in the US, not just from Biden, we see it all over the place. I see comments in particular in places like Western Europe, in places like Australia. There's sort of a tall poppy syndrome where it has become unpopular. In fact, there is a desire to pull down or to prevent people from becoming too wealthy. There's all sorts of calls for people who are wealthy or make a lot of money to quote unquote pay their fair share. And I figured we would take a moment. I have lots of clients who are wealthy people. We deal lots with helping people to pay less taxes. And so I think it's worth taking a moment to examine, well, what is really fair? Is this really a negative thing? And how do we measure and dive into that? Because there's a lot of facts here that people may not be aware of, and I think you may find it quite interesting to figure out what this is. Now, before I go in, I'd love to hear from you guys. If you want to put in the comments below, what is it that you think the fair share should be, and based on what? We're going to talk a little bit about it now. Before we do, welcome everyone. I'm Michael with Offshore Citizen, looking forward to sharing with you 3 really interesting perspectives on how to look at this particular issue, hopefully give a balanced, two-sided look at it. I do think that I was making a comment on Twitter and somebody mentioned that it was unusual that I'm somebody who has a business that one of the big things we do is help people to reduce tax, and yet I'm not inherently anti-tax, I'm not inherently anti-government. I do think there's a lot to be said for the fact that governments are a system of coordination that we need for people to cooperate between each other. I don't think that there's something inherently bad with government, although I do think any power structure is, of course, open to abuse. Abuse is not an argument against proper use. And of course, the moment we're going to do things together, we do have to have some collective way to contribute to that, which hence results in taxes. However, once again, just because of the fact that there is good taxes doesn't mean necessarily there are not bad taxes. And so we're going to talk a little bit about it in a moment. Before we do, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button. Thank you for being here. Welcome. I'm Michael from Offshore Citizen. We're international tax, relocation, etc. experts. And for anyone who's interested in discussing those topics further, you can check out at the end of the video. I'll give you a little bit of detail as well as our website. Anyway, let's talk about this initial point, which is, what does it mean to pay your fair share? Now, I was involved in a conversation with a group of people that brought this subject up recently, and it was pointed out that the top 1%, for the sake of this argument, we'll refer to the top 1%, pay something like 42% of the federal income taxes, okay? And so somebody mentioned, well, that's a pretty high number. And somebody responded, they said, well, hang on a second. Actually, it should be 63%. Very interesting, right? 42, 63, what is a fair number for the 1% to pay? And so I asked, hey, what makes you think that 63 happens to be the fair number? So in order to understand that, I think we need to go back in history and look at a series of events that took place during the time starting in 2019 and ending at the end of 2021. And that will be a bit of foreshadowing as to the rest of the story, which will follow in a moment. So what happened? Well, in 2019, you had a relatively good year in the markets. You were in a situation where we were in a long-term bull cycle. People had done pretty well that year, and things were arguably a bit shaky. The smart investors tended to get out of the market early 2020, and of course we had COVID, followed by a big economic crash that frankly was displacing for a bunch of people, was really negative for a bunch, and some people were huge beneficiaries of it. Now, sadly, what happened in that moment in time? Maybe for better or for worse, governments around the world gave a tremendous amount of stimulus. They printed a lot of money. About $5 trillion or so arguably went into the US economy, and lots more globally, probably somewhere around $10+ trillion by the time all was said and done. And what happened to this? Well, a lot of it flowed into financial assets, and we saw stock markets go like crazy, crypto went like crazy, real estate went like crazy. And who are the people who principally own stocks, crypto, real estate, etc.? These are typically people who are in the 1%. People who are in the 1% just tend to hold more financial assets. People who are quote unquote lower down are in a situation where they just don't have as much in terms of savings. They don't have as much of their net worth in assets. They may not have much net worth at all. In fact, many of them have debt. And so as a result, the growth in wealth that happened during this 2-year period from basically the end of 2019 to the end of 2021, 63% of it went to the 1%, okay? So there was a growth of, I think it was 40-some trillion dollars, and of that 40-some trillion dollars, something like 26 trillion of it went to the top 1%. Now it is worth stopping for just a quick little moment here to reflect on where we're at, because I do think a lot of people have a misnomer about what the 1% is, and they tend not to think of themselves as the 1% when in fact they are. So for me, as somebody who's lived in many countries of the world, typically poor countries around the world, I would say that almost anyone in the West is the 1%. And generally speaking, if you are sitting in the middle class in a Western country and pointing at the rich, you are the rich by global standards. So there's a little bit of hypocrisy that shows up there. And I'm kind of quick to call that out because I think that it's very, very myopic in its approach. So not something that I would generally recommend. I think it's worth noting that we are quite blessed to have what we have, whether just, if you're somebody from a country where, you're born with great functioning utilities, good jobs, public services, et cetera, et cetera. This is a pretty privileged position that you're in. And so to try and compare yourself to somebody who's maybe truly poor in places like Africa, India, other parts of the world is maybe a bit of a misnomer. However, just to put it into context, if in order to be in the 1%, for the purpose of this study that I'm mentioning, I think it was around $1 million net worth that they said. Now, depending on where you are, that might or might not be slightly higher than that, but this is not a lot of money, mainly because people's principal residences today tend to be worth quite a bit, plus they have retirement funds, etc. So we're not talking about the super rich here, we're talking about the 1%. It's worth understanding that for the purposes of how much income that is, in a country like Canada, it's a little over $200,000 last I checked. This is 200,000 Canadian dollars in earned income per year. So, by a lot of people's standards, it's high, but it's not outrageously high. It's not like you're making $1 million a year or something like that. Generally, other parts of the world, like in the US, again, it varies state by state, but as I recall, you're talking about around $450,000 a year to be in the 1%. And then some other countries, you could be as low as, lower than $50,000 a year to be in the 1%. We're talking about, Eastern European countries, et cetera. So that gives a little bit of context on who the 1% actually are. However, the point is there's 1% and there's 99%. There's a lot more in the 99% than there are in the 1%, right? So we're saying that, well, hang on a minute, 63% of the wealth went to this small group of people. And you might say, well, therefore, it would seem reasonable, right, that these people should have paid 63% of the taxes, not 42% of the taxes. And I think some people, from a certain perspective, you might say, well, yeah, that strikes me as fair, right? Now, there's a few different issues with that. So the first is, of course, this is measuring the growth in wealth. This is not measuring the actual income. And most of the time, this wealth is paper gains. So you might be somebody who the value of your house went up by 30% during the 2020, 21, maybe into 2022 period of time. And because your house is worth a lot, maybe let's just say it was $600,000. Well, if it went up 33%, you just gained $200,000. Are you going to pay taxes on that? No, because you're not going to sell it. And so it's really important to recognize that a key aspect of this is the growth in wealth is paper gains. You shouldn't really focus on that. And there was a ProPublica piece that was put out. I did a criticism video on it back at the time. Not necessarily a great indicator of where people are. And here's where the rest of the story comes in, which is, well, the stock market then proceeded to tumble. A lot of things fell. If we're talking about financial assets and stocks, many of the ones that went up a lot dropped something like 80%. Crypto dropped in many cases 90%. And real estate, we haven't really seen come down massively yet, but may come down. So you have to put it on both sides where you say, well, hang on a minute. If these people had the most wealth increase, then what about when they have the most wealth decrease? Are you going to compensate for it on the other side, right? And of course, the answer is that they don't want to. They want to call those people out based on income when it suits them and based on wealth when it suits them. And so you kind of have a double standard. I think if it was always consistent on one side or another, that would be a little bit fair. However, in this case, it's not. Very, very important distinction between growth in wealth and what we're talking about in terms of like actual functional income. Although there is lots to be said for this growth in wealth side, right? At the end of the day, some people do realize it, they do sell, or you have the ability to collateralize and borrow against those assets and access some of the liquidity without doing it. It turns out those paper gains can be erased really fast, and they are just that until they're crystallized. So really, really important distinction, I think, in that first perspective. But it does lead us into something, a second point of view, which is you can say, all right, well, what about the actual share that was paid, right? What does that, how does that look? And it turns out that here the numbers are a little bit deceptive. So they'll say, oh yeah, 42% of taxes were paid by the 1%. Well, that's a little bit misleading. 42% of federal income tax in the US was paid by the top 1%. It turns out, if you dive into it, there's of course state taxes, and state taxes skew this comparison. Then you have something like payroll taxes, and payroll taxes are overwhelmingly borne by sort of the middle class, right? Not the 1%, because the 1% tend to be more likely to earn income from capital. So because of that, it tilts the numbers somewhat. And then of course we have sales tax, right? As well as other consumption taxes, kind of vice taxes like taxes on cigarettes, taxes on gasoline, taxes on property, et cetera, right? So if we look at that in its wholeness, the 42% is taken out of context and is somewhat deceptive. And so you may make the argument that actually the 42% is not the full amount that is paid by these people. It's just one slice of the puzzle, and when you equalize that out, it becomes less significant. All right, so fair enough, we can argue, well, hang on a minute, if that's true, then what are the real numbers and what is the perspective here? And so one of the pieces of information that I'm going to put into context for you is the adjusted gross income of those people. So we talked first about wealth, right? Now let's talk about actual income. And it turns out that it was 42.3% of taxes were paid by the 1% in 2019, in 2020, as an example. And at that point in time, 22% of the income was earned by those people. Okay, so again, the 42% isn't a real 42%. I've seen on various talk shows, etc., some people who are kind of hardcore capitalist libertarian type people coming out and saying, well, hang on a minute, the rich pay this, but they're missing that full picture. And I do think that's somewhat disingenuous. I think you should be, if your position is strong and you can defend it, then you should be in a position where you can go out and you can argue based on the full data and not isolate some slice of data that supports your position. So it turns out when you correct for those other taxes, it's more like a third. Now, that third is still a lot more than the 22.2%. So you can ask, okay, well, hang on a minute. If we're in a situation here where 1%, the 1% of people, obviously it's a small percentage of people who's paying a large share of the taxes, so maybe that would seem fair. But you're like, well, yeah, but hang on, that 1% of people also happens to earn 22.2% of the income in this particular year, and they're taxed a bit more than that, right? So it's not proportional to what they're earning. Okay, fair enough. But let's reframe it, okay? There's a very interesting reframing that you can do on this that I think is important. And to illustrate it best, let's tell a little story. Say you have a group of people, say it's a classroom of students, all right? And this classroom of students ends up going out and they have some particular subject that they're being taught. Let's just say, for instance, that it is football, okay, or American soccer, okay? So they're gonna go play. And what is going to be the natural distribution of people within this game, right? What you're gonna find inherently in all cases is you will have some people who will take the game more seriously than others. Some people are really going to want to play the game. They're going to get out there, they're going to work harder, they're going to go to training camps, they're going to, get extra coaching, they're going to invest in extra equipment, they're going to give up other activities to pursue being really good at this game. On the flip side, you are going to have some people who are going to say, I'm not really interested, and they're not going to put the effort in. Okay? Now, naturally, what is going to happen in this case? The people who put in more effort, who take the game more seriously, are going to score more goals. They're going to outplay those who take it less seriously. It's just the way that it goes. And it turns out money is really no different than this, right? There are some people for whom making money and working at business and finance and things like that, they care a lot. And those people are, generally speaking, going to outperform. That's to say, those who it means a lot to them are going to outperform those who it does not. And so you can ask the question, you can say, well, hang on a minute. If I sacrificed more, if I worked harder, if I cared more about it, and I really put the effort in, and therefore I got greater rewards, and you chose not to, then why is it that I should have to compensate for what you didn't do, right? And there's kind of this famous expression which says, if you're in a situation where you want to give to somebody who doesn't have, then you have to take from somebody who produced, right? So in other words, there's no free lunch. At the end of the day, somebody produces something, and in order for somebody who didn't produce it to have it, it needs to be taken from somebody who did produce it. And so there's an inherent unfairness there, right? The inherent fairness, you would say, is, hey, the person who produces it, they get to keep it. The person who doesn't produce it doesn't get to keep it. What's the fairness on that stance? When you think about it from this perspective, let's try reframing it. Instead of saying the people, their income, the adjusted gross income of the top 1% was 22.2%, say the productivity of them was this. In other words, the top 1% produced 22.2% of net financial assets, of gains. Well, if you say, okay, well, hang on, they're producers, that's a little bit different than to say they had an income or they got. As soon as you reframe it to thinking in terms of, hey, these guys are producing more, so of course they have more, so why should you take from them? These other people didn't produce as much, so why should they get more? There's this question of fairness, right? And I think that's another fair perspective to take on it. But it does lead us to, I think, an additional part of the equation, which is the other side. And here we will tell the other story. Okay, so what is the other story? The other story is, let's just say you are somebody who's working really hard and producing all kinds of things, and it turns out you decide to go someplace where it's a private gated community and you pay for private security and you pay for private roads and so on and so forth, right? Somebody else is in a neighborhood where maybe they're not working as hard, right? They're in a location where it's more dangerous. They end up using public policing services. They maybe need some assistance, therefore they end up getting welfare payments. Maybe they're in a situation where they have some sort of family member who has an illness and they need to go to the hospital. They can't afford private health care, so they have to get public health care, etc. What's the story here? The story is one group of people are using a different amount of resources than the other, right? In other words, what's fair? Is it based on what you have? Is it based on what you produce? Is it based on what you consume? The reality is, on average, wealthy people tend to commit less violent crime, right? They tend to be in a situation where they're simply not going to use various of the services. Now, this is not universal, because certainly if you have systems like in the US, the way they fund the school system is really deplorable. And in fact, these schools are more expensive and well-funded in wealthier neighborhoods. So this is pretty messed up and kind of creates a perpetual system of poverty to some extent. And there's something deeply deranged about that system. Let's just put it that way. But on the other hand, you have to admit, rich people aren't using welfare. Rich people are more likely to have private security, which means they don't need and gated communities, et cetera, which means they aren't relying on public policing. They are less likely to be in a situation where they themselves are going out and committing various crimes, et cetera, et cetera. That's probably a super controversial statement. I mean, it's just statistically accurate, which makes sense as well, right? It shouldn't be offensive to somebody. It's just, if somebody has more, they're going to be less likely to go into a life of crime. You're probably in a different social circle, et cetera. But let's just take a look at what's going on here. What's going on fundamentally is that there's a different amount of resources used. So what's fair, right? Biden is telling you, look, I'm going to come for your money. I think rich people should pay their fair share. Okay, great. Well, what is fair? The truth is, what they're really saying is, I'm waving a flag that is popular with voters, and I'm trying to get people angry with emotional language of fairness. And the truth is, fair is highly subjective. There's no real sense of what's fair or not fair. We can strive to be more fair, but if you really want to be fair, you should be looking at what are people producing, what are people consuming in terms of goods, and what are the ways that they're benefiting overall, right? Because how you spend your money actually does make a big difference. Some people are going to spend their money in frivolous ways. Some people are going to spend their money in productive ways. Should those people be taxed the same? They might have the same amount of wealth. They might have the same amount of income. But, should a criminal be taxed the same as a law-abiding citizen? Is that fair? It doesn't strike me as fair. Does it strike you as fair? And this kind of comes to a last point that I think, which is, if you're sitting there contributing taxes, what is one of the concerns with contributing taxes? I did a video a while ago about how, in my opinion, it is the most ethical possible thing that you can do in most developed societies, to pay as little tax as you can possibly get away with, as little as legally possible. And I'd invite you to go check out that video. I kind of walked through the logic of why this is. If you actually care about the betterment of society, you should probably lower your taxes, not increase your taxes, which is kind of a weird concept to some people, but I invite you to go check out the video. The point here that I want to get at is there is a deep, deranged problem going on in society, and that is that the incentives in government are not to spend money in a way that is productive. It is not to do some things which are efficient. There is no accountability for poor spending, and there's no incentive to spend well. This simply does not exist within the system. There's a lot of graft, there's a lot of inefficiency, there's a growing amount of waste. And so if we want to come back to this question of fairness, then maybe the people who are working hardest, who are producing the most, who then maybe end up getting taxed the most and contribute the most, should also have a disproportionate voice in how that money gets spent. Imagine how things would be different if you were in a situation where the amount of money that you contribute, you then get to allocate to the buckets of efficiency. And there's a voting with your dollars. How would that change the behavior of government officials? Obviously, you'd want to make it so that you can't have corruption where you give it to an official who's going to give it back to you, but maybe there's a set of baskets or a set of managers within the system, and the people who are managing best, they can allocate accordingly. A little bit like you do within private industry through something like the stock market. How would that change the outcome? I have a deep, deep problem with all these conversations of paying their fair share, because I think it ignores the real root problems. I think there's serious root problems in the way that governments function today. It's very, very bad. It's definitely not headed in the right direction. And to go and point blame at a small group of people and to suggest that, oh, we need more money. Listen, you're running a massive deficit. You're highly inefficient about what you're doing. You do not need more money. Governments in most of the world today do not have a revenue problem. They have a spending problem. And that spending problem is not going to go away by taxing the rich. So I think it's very, very misplaced for people to focus on that. And it is, it's a manipulation tactic, effectively, to say things like pay their fair share, hit on people's emotional triggers, etc. That would be my opinion, and hence, we help people relocate to other countries where hopefully they are, enjoying a life that is more to their choosing, as well as helping them to optimize their global tax, because when you make more money that you then get to keep, you can then allocate that to the things that you value, and you don't have to be subject to somebody else mismanaging that money for you. The reality is they're going to spend it regardless. You spending money in taxes will not change what it is that they spend. They will just accumulate it in debt, so you might as well take your money and allocate it in the ways that you think are best. If you're interested in that, please reach out to us. You can book a call with me, calendly.com/Michael-Rosmer. There's a link in the description below. Hit the subscribe button. Tell me what you think in the comments below, and I will look forward to seeing you on the next video.